Thanks. Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about vertical AI startups, which I'll define in a second. But first I'm going to talk about some lessons learned. So my background, I've been doing applied machine learning since 2002 when I left school. I was first at Virginia Tech, and then I started doing hedge funds at that time. I went to Google in the mid-2000s. I worked on a system there called Borg, which is like what Mesos is based on. If you know Mesos, it's a distributed operating system kernel. And then I left and started doing machine learning startups in 2009. First one was Flightcaster. That was a YC startup. We sold that after a couple of years. And then I did some graduate work at Berkeley. And then I started doing more machine learning startups. I also started DCVC at that time. That was 2011. Which has now grown into being kind of the leading AI-focused VC globally. So our timing was really good on that. And the point of showing this whole thing is, that I've been doing this kind of stuff for a while, so I'm trying to share some lessons learned from having a fairly large sample size of my own experience, my friends' experience, and my experience with DCVC in building AI startups for nearly 20 years now. So first, a few lessons learned. So a model is not a product. Working backward from a market instead of forward from tech is really important. I see a lot of people now that are diving into the AI startup game that are making exactly the same errors that we were, 20 to 10 years ago, with these sort of hammers looking for nails. And it's definitely a huge cautionary thing. You really don't want to do this. You want to focus on the market need and find something that matches up with like a core need for AI by all means, so you don't end up building like a simple CRUD app, which you don't want to work on. But really start from the need first, don't start from the tech first. Another one is data being more valuable than models, and the fact that there's many ways to capture dependencies between things. So there's all kinds of different model families you can use and approaches you can use for different problems. And it really doesn't matter as much as being able to get the right data for the problems that you're tackling. So I see a lot of people that are sort of founding on this premise that they have some superior new deep net architecture, and it's just not really a defensible thing. It doesn't really matter very much. Because in the end of the day, you want to turn hard problems into easy ones anyways, and a lot of the times it's about these clever data acquisition hacks and stuff like that, more so than whatever particular kind of models you're using. And also just the way that research is done in a modern setting, in my view, is sort of having the researchers working directly with the engineers, only having research engineers that are writing production code, not having any of this more scientist or data scientist type role that does some stuff that's not really proper code, and then somebody else has to rewrite it separately on the engineering team. Don't really believe in doing stuff that way, and I think in particular for startups it's a real killer because you just don't have the time for that type of development cycle. So now specifically let's get into vertical AI startups. So the rest of this talk, I'm not sure how interested people are going to be in it, honestly. It's very financial and for a little while here. I'm basically trying to explain the motivation financially for why you should want to start these vertically oriented AI startups, instead of horizontally oriented ones like machine learning as a service or other kinds of things like this. So first, actually, so what are vertical AI startups? So they're full stack products. They require subject matter expertise from a particular domain. They have some type of proprietary data that they gather from that domain. And then they use AI to deliver the core value proposition of the product. It's not a bolt-on thing that you're doing for marketing or whatever. You actually need it to deliver the core value of the product. Some kind of computer vision or NLP or ranking or what have you is really core to the whole thing. So why would you do this? Why would you go vertical? What are the motivations for it? Number one is don't get ripped off, right? So when you solve the business problem directly, you're in a position of leverage to capture much more value in the stack. When you're sort of an SDK or an API or something like that, and then somebody else is satiating the end need of the user, on top of that, they kind of are in the position of power, right? Because they're the one who's interacting with the end user, and they're the one who's accepting the real money from the end person who's paying, and then they're paying down the stack to you. You're in the weak market position there, it's really not a great business, and we see a lot of things that are doing this, and you really need to bump up the stack if you don't want to get ripped off. So the other one is software is eating the world, so every company now needs to be an awesome tech company, and of course they can't even really do that. If you look in different sectors in financial services, for example, or all kinds of other older school domains, they just can't really become tech companies effectively. So either beat them at what they're doing, or sell them stuff that makes them into tech companies. But this is another reason for going vertical, right? If you look at all the other tech companies, they're all full of smart tech people, right? And so you don't want to compete against them. You want to compete against all these other verticals where there aren't a lot of smart tech people, but they have to basically become tech companies, right? It's much more white space there. Another one is that when you do vertical product focus, you get this proprietary data effect where you're capturing more and more data that's specific to the types of problems that you have. This is really the sort of money-making machine, right? You end up optimizing this really esoteric problems that are very specific to a particular domain and are extremely valuable, and you can charge a lot for. And in many situations, you can get your business into a position where you're the only one that has that data, right? Which is incredibly valuable. And obviously you don't want to become abusive or whatever, but you basically have sort of monopolistic pricing power and so on there. It's the old Peter Thiel thing of like wanting to get into a monopoly position. And then most importantly, vertical cohorts win. This is what I'm just going to show right now. And winning is awesome. You actually want to win. So enterprise cohorts, what's up with these things? So this is this cool couple of posts that the Sapphire Ventures guys put out. So if anyone, I'll pause here for a second if anyone wants to like jot down these headlines or whatever as a quick note to look for them. It's pretty cool. They did a bunch of research, but I'm going to summarize it all here. So the point is that enterprise exits come in cohorts, and consumer exits come in these huge outliers, right? Like Facebook or Snapchat, as we just saw, or WhatsApp or whatever. But let's dissect the numbers and think about what that means for us that are building AI startups. So in enterprise, we've actually in the past, this is since I think 95, there's actually been more total exits, right? But there's been less than half of those exits has come from the top 5 as compared to consumer. So if you look at this, consumer actually has much larger amount of cash that's been returned from the top 5 exits. But if you sum the whole thing up, it's actually still smaller than the rest of the exits that are not in the top 5 from the enterprise world, right? So when you think about it, we're actually going after a pretty sweet and large pie if we just completely ignore consumer stuff and just look at enterprise and not even in the top 5, right? That's a big pie. And this is just further showing, you know, how basically 36% of the overall returns are from the top 5 things in consumer, right? And so in reality, I think you look at AI startups, you know, frankly, I don't think you should be imagining yourself as building another Facebook or another Google where you're going to build a $300 billion company, right? But the idea of building a multi-billion-dollar company and having a good shot at doing so within a broad set of cohorts in different industries, I think is actually a very interesting outcome and kind of what we should be aiming for. So these cohorts come from waves of venture investment when people sort of get excited about going after one of these little vertical niches or whatever and think that the timing is right for doing so. So keep calm and be a cohort winner, like that's your kind of goal, right? Is like pick one of these kind of cohorts that you want to go after that you think is going to have a material impact in an industry and just go after that one, right? So let's look at the unicorn cohort. So this is coming from a current list that I just got off of the CB Insights guy's site. And I took the 150 or so unicorn startups and I clustered them by their sort of focus area, right? So just taking a look here as an example, right, and these, you know, a lot of these things are gonna flop, but quite a lot of them are actually pretty legit businesses, so I think we'll see a bunch of IPOs from a lot of these companies that are on this list. So if you look at some of these, like you have a pretty nice cohort in fintech, pretty nice one in healthcare. Some of these other ones are techie kind of niches, like the whole movement in e-com and on-demand, right? But you kind of get a sense of, you know, also cybersecurity there. You kind of get a sense of some of the cohorts that are up and coming where multi-billion-dollar companies already exist in the private market. And then, so zooming in specifically to fintech, right? You can see that actually within all of financial services, the vast majority of the investment dollars and traction is just in lending and payments, right? So I've taken to doing a bunch of stuff in fintech because I'm intrigued by it because it's one of the largest sectors in the world, and there hasn't really been that much venture investment or startup activity, and it's been confined almost entirely to lending and payments. So if you look at like real estate and insurance, for example, which are just monstrously large markets, right? There just isn't very much activity at all, you know, as compared to lending and payments. So now let's look specifically at AI. So now I looked at the data for the top 120 companies in AI that currently have raised $30 million or more. So let's look at where we see some kind of developments here. Again, here you look at fintech and at healthcare, and they're pretty well represented at the top of the heap there in terms of the dollars that have been invested and the number of companies that you see. And then again, like security is up there, marketing is up there, right? So these are the kind of things where you have actual, you know, traction. This is kind of our best proxy for traction. Some of this stuff might be vaporware or whatever, but all these guys have raised over 30 million bucks, which isn't easy to do, and presumably a lot of them are doing so on the backs of real business traction because these are B2B companies, right? So I think it's interesting. It's showing you some of the emerging, you know, like sort of industry clusters within AI startups. Now zooming in a little bit on what are the problems that they're kind of solving, right? What are the classes of different sort of statistical or machine learning problems that these startups are tackling within those industry verticals? So it's interesting that the top one is underwriting, actually, because the lending stuff has blown up so big, right? And those guys are all counted among these AI startups because they're mostly all using machine learning for their underwriting models. This thing's actually the top category, even though there's only 6 companies there. There's just pretty big successful set of companies. It's also interesting to acknowledge that that doesn't even include the ones that have gone public yet. Some of them have already exited. So the real number is even bigger there if you look at the cohort that's formed over the past decade, because some of them are already public. But you see also just like prediction problems, optimization problems, vision. NLP is up there and almost at the same level. So you start to see, you know, a really kind of high value clusters of problems that people are attacking that are behind a lot of these industry problems too. So I think that's also worthy to think about, is like, you know, what are the types of industry problems that you can attack with the types of things where you're strong? Like if you're a really strong NLP person, or you're coming out of a computer vision group or whatever, you know, you can kind of align those skills with particular industry verticals where they're highly valuable at the moment, as opposed to thinking about, you know, let's just make an API for tagging photos. So, and also interesting, within the AI startup world, you can see that the vast majority of the investment has been in enterprise, right? So it's about 10x. Okay, so diving into finance and healthcare a little bit. These are the 2 biggest sectors, really, in terms of verticals that we should think about outside of tech, right? Because obviously, you know, if tech, this is by market cap in the US, right? So tech is the biggest, obviously we're tech, so that's not the vertical we're trying to go after. So finance, that's one. Consumer services, we're not really trying to go after that. That's not a specific like subject matter oriented vertical. That's not the goal of this whole vertical AI thing I'm talking about. So we want to go after healthcare. That's the next biggest one, and you can see in order there, you know, energy is also a very interesting one. But for now, I'm just going to zoom in on finance and healthcare, the biggest 2. Here, notice that there's only 4 of these sectors that have a market cap in aggregate that's above 5 trillion US, right? And again, healthcare and finance are in that group. And notice it's a pretty significant drop-off after that. So this is really like these world's largest sectors they're pretty large. Right? And if you look at by margin, also they're represented here. So again, if you take an aggregate, this is everything, every company that you have financials on in all these sectors. Those that are above 8% margin in aggregate only include the 4 that are at the top. And again, you see financial services and healthcare represented there. So great industries with margin at scale. So the point of these slides is to show, you know, keep your markets big, go after big markets. That's an awesome starting point. And then look for white space and timing. So this white space and timing thing is really pretty important for me. It's, for me, something that I have come to appreciate over time is incredibly important, and probably more important than almost anything else that you can do. Because number one, you don't want to be part of a group where there's way too many people and too few opportunity. And you see that a lot of times in startups where people back a big cohort like a theme, and there's not really a market there, and then you have a ton of startups with a bunch of smart people all going after it, and they're all overfunded, and it's sort of like this horrible death march. So you don't want this situation where there's no white space. You want like open white space. You don't want to see a lot of other people doing it. Like for example, me personally right now, I wouldn't do anything in self-driving cars, right? There's too many smart people there. And maybe there's going to be another one of these billion-dollar exits that's started this year that some giant car company buys. That could totally be the case. But for me personally, it looks like there's not that much white space in the self-driving car thing because there's just too much smart people working in that area for me. Too many, rather. And so the other one is timing. Like, why is this going to happen now? A lot of times people will pitch a startup, especially like a deep tech startup, and they'll start with like something is broken, like X is broken. And the fact that X is broken kind of doesn't mean that much because there's a lot of X's that are broken in the world. And the question is like, why are people going to fix this one now? Right? Because the default state of most stuff is for it to be, you know, a little bit messed up, let's say, right? And so why is this going to be the thing that I'm going to focus on this year of all the things that I could be trying to fix? And there has to be a lot of reasons, like a stack of reasons. I call them catalysts, right? But you want a stack of reasons as to why this should be done right now. And it should have very little to do with your opinion or the fact that you worked on this stuff in grad school or whatever. And it should have a lot to do with why people want to buy it immediately because they really have this as a top priority for this year. So really focus on the timing thing. There's a cool talk about this if you want to check it out that Bill Gross did, the guy from Idea Lab, as like a little TEDx talk. It's like a little 10-minute talk or whatever. I highly recommend watching that one. It's pretty cool. It was after one of my past failures, and I was like picking myself up, and I was watching this talk, and it really resonated with me, and that's what really changed my focus to be much more on timing, you know. And he was just like, it gives all these examples of how it doesn't matter if you even had the right idea and the right team and everything else, but the wrong time, like even a difference of 2 years sometimes can be make or break. And he gives the example of YouTube and how there were other people right before YouTube, and they just actually didn't have the bandwidth, you know, in general in the US yet to make the streaming video work. And just like 2 years or 3 years later, it started to barely be possible. And I think that's when there was finally the door open for somebody like YouTube to be successful. So again, it's this timing thing where there's so many factors and you really have to think about it a lot. And don't be the hammer looking for a nail, right? This is the thing that you see all the time in deep tech and in AI and data startups, and we've backed a lot of them, and I've been guilty of this myself multiple times. Like, you have an idea and the world really doesn't give a shit. Like, just only focus on what people actually want. Seriously, it's going to be better off for all of us. So future cohorts that I think are interesting, like I mentioned, I think that insurance and real estate are awesome because these are, you know, the two of the biggest areas inside financial services and two of the biggest areas in the world. And as you just saw when I showed earlier the sort of fintech breakdown, you just have not seen the amount of traction or investment dollars going into these areas yet, but you start to see some exciting glimmers. Like one of my friends and a guy who used to work with me at Prismatic is one of the founders of Open Door, which has this whole model of sort of buying on spot using their machine learning model of somebody's house and then setting it up in a certain way for people to come and look at. I don't know if you guys have read about them or whatever and checked out their model, but that's really cool. That's an example of somebody doing something very, very innovative in real estate. And I know they've been growing fast, doing large financings, and they're like pretty richly valued, and I think a pretty healthy-looking company. And I'm kind of looking at and doing a bunch of stuff in insurance that I can't really talk about, but I think that's a very exciting area, obviously. But like lending and payments, for example, I think they already happen. So like, again, doing some analysis, you might look at that area and decide maybe it's not the right time to do anything there. I think in terms of pharma, the unsexy tail end of it, all the clinical trials and manufacturing and everything, the more we've analyzed that, the more that looks exciting. The upfront part of it, where a lot more startups focus that are doing AI for drug discovery and so on, can also be a good model. You can figure out a compound and just flip it to big pharma. But like the massive amount of money and spend and big issues and bottlenecks in it are actually on that tail. So that's pretty exciting for me. And then aerial imagery is another area that I think is really exciting. There's big new data sets there coming online that are really useful in a huge host of different domain problems. And what's exciting for me here is that when you take all the new stuff in deep learning and all these giant new data sets from aerial imagery, and you think about all the features you can extract from that and the data sets that you can join it with, based on lat long time, there's a lot of possibilities for predicting different things, automating different tasks, et cetera. But when I see what the folks have done in this space so far, it's mostly very, very obvious stuff, which is like agriculture and defense for the most part, with a bit of finance, hedge fundy type stuff. But we did an analysis sort of looking, again, like I was showing, at every different industry vertical. What are the use cases in each vertical? What are the reasons why that should happen now? You can find business opportunities where the business catalysts intersect with these technical catalysts, and that becomes very interesting because now you have this massive new reservoir of data that clearly has a ton of value in it, and we have the tools to be able to extract the value now. But you have a bunch of people that are only focusing on the very obvious problems, and meanwhile every other vertical is sort of untouched thus far. So I think that's an exciting opportunity. So that's it. That's vertical AI startups. That's kind of all I want to talk about, and then I was hoping to have a bit more time for Q&A.
Right here.
So on timing, how do you evaluate timing? I mean, it's not easy to say the timing is right.
Yeah, it's definitely not. I think if it were easy, then there would be a lot more giant companies. Yeah, I mean, I think it requires a lot of analysis and being honest with yourself. I think a lot of people could easily go and have the conversations and do the market research to do it, but one of the biggest blockers is this cognitive bias of trying to validate your own ideas, right? You get excited about something and trying to validate your own stuff. So taking more of a scientific mind early on, being a little bit more kind of mind like water in terms of what you're willing to do in the beginning instead of being really attached to an idea, I think is a really big deal because people face this upfront psychological block, which is a real killer. And then the other one is just being really methodical and looking at doing market research, going out and talking to people, figuring out how to synthesize all the data together in a way that gives you a real picture of how exciting this is. Looking at other options, so you look at what your opportunity cost is and or is this really look good compared to these other things or not? And I think the more you do it, the more you develop your own sort of toolbox and techniques for doing that. But I suggest to people that they spend more time on that upfront than otherwise you might. And the idea that you just go and iterate is sort of like, if you think about it from an optimization standpoint, right? Like you're just starting at some place that you landed in the space and just sort of fucking like hill climbing around, right? And it's like, how do you know you're in the right area at all, right? You don't really. So you can't efficiently explore the entire space in this little iterative like execution way. So you need some analytical framework to explore more broadly first and then narrow. So, what that analytical framework is depends on the thing, but it's got to involve market research, talking to customers, and really spending some time on it before I think you just start randomly building stuff. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh. Hey, do you want to go first? All right, well, the microphone's here, so
sorry.
I'll pass it.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No problem. So first of all, as a DC-backed founder, I want to say you guys are great and would recommend anyone looking for funding, talk to you guys. It's been a good relationship. Second of all, really appreciate the talk. I like what you said about focusing on the enterprise, about it being kind of less about long tail and much more likely to have an exit. But one of the things you said is something I've been struggling with, which is you should focus on kind of the quick, hacky, I don't say quick, but hacks around data acquisition, finding data, and reconciling that with enterprise B2B plays. Like in the consumer space, you can think of making a Facebook game or an app or something like the Comma AI guys have their Dashcam app. What approaches do you take to that data gathering to bootstrap an enterprise B2B startup when companies aren't going to just hand over their databases to you before you have anything?
Great question. So I think there's two classes of approaches here. One of them is the approach where, I have this thing, give me some data, we plug it in, and you get instant value out of it. That's one approach, the tit-for-tat strategy, let's call it. The other strategy is this sort of outside-in strategy, where it's like, I'm going to go and use a bunch of information extraction and crawling and snarfing a variety of data sets from all over the place, and I'm going to go and do some like weird deal with my friend's startup and get data from them, or just anything that you have to do, this like hustle and grind of like acquiring data, aggregating something together so that you have something from the outside, and then you come in and you're like, listen, I already have this like relatively canonical understanding of thing X, I can tell you this about your business now, and I can tell you this other deeper thing if we like plug your data together with it. So that's another maneuver that can work. But I think you're kind of doing one of those two things, and there's always this argument that this is this bootstrapping problem that you have in the B2B space with startups. There's this argument that the companies have. It's like you're 3 months old. How could you don't have anything? You don't know shit about shit, right? Like you don't know anything. Why am I going to give you data or do anything with you? And you got to have an answer for that, which has to be that you've done some clever thing in terms of being able to build something from the outside that you can immediately show value with if data is plugged into it, or that you've been able to gather your own data from the outside and show value even independently of doing anything with them. And then you can show them how like there's even more value if they plug their data into that. So I do think you need to watch out for things where you don't have either one of those value propositions, and you have like a dubious sell where you like actually don't really understand much of anything, and you're just trying to get them to give you their data and present you with the business problems that need to be solved and stuff like that, right? And there's like these super dubious early stage startup propositions like that. You got to make sure you have something, when you come in. But I would run either one of those two playbooks. Those are the ones that I see like work consistently. Yeah. Okay, over here now, yes.
Thank you, Bradford. If you're looking at areas where the validation is going to take longer than a few months, it's going to take perhaps even a few years.
Yeah.
And you're also looking for that same kind of quasi-monopolistic lock on the data, become the source. Doesn't that argue to move down your list a little bit further than your top 5 and be a little bit more anticipatory?
Yeah. I'm not necessarily saying that you should need to focus all your energies in those ones that are already the biggest ones, right? Like I was pointing out in fintech, that you saw already there's been some number of modicums of wins with real estate and insurance, but not nearly to the effect of lending and payments. And I was advocating for that as an example of why you might focus on those two areas instead. So yes, I definitely agree. But at the same time, you want to be careful about, there's also this other phenomena where a lot of the times the reason that nobody's working in an area is because actually nobody cares about it, right? And that's also a trap too. So you got to be careful about these like the white space that's like that for a reason because there's nothing over there, right? So yeah, that happens a lot too. So yeah, it's actually a black hole of energy, right? Exactly that. Exactly.
Over here, great talk. I really enjoyed it. Jack Porter with Razor Think, and we do vertical, but instead of being industry vertical, we're kind of like segment vertical. So we do churn, upsell, campaign effectiveness.
Yeah.
But we do it in finance with American Express and
Yeah.
Discover Card, but we also do it in telecommunications with Reliance, very big company. How do you see that play into this kind of?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's sort of like this tools level of stuff in B2B, which also includes just like a lot of the sales software and marketing software and stuff, right? So I would almost say that it is, and it's like I was showing up there, that there's like this sort of marketing like cohort, right, within the AI startups. And so I think in a way you kind of are, specific, vertical within that sort of like area, that sort of like task-based area. But you might have like multiple actual industries that you serve. Same as like a Salesforce does, right? Yeah, I mean, I think you get a lot of the similar types of effects. Yep, you get the same kind of thing with cohorts happening, and it's just sort of like, it's a layer down the stack from like the heavily domain-specific, like super vertically oriented, in terms of industry vertically oriented startup. But I think that there are going to be successes there, and there already have been, and when you talk about like marketing and sales and things like that, or customer engagement, and especially, again, focusing on the key verticals like financial services where there's a lot of, dollars for that type of software, I think those companies will be also very successful, and we'll get some similar effects in terms of potentially even like network effects of data and things like this, as they can get multiple customers to opt in to sharing either data directly, or if you can't share data, sometimes you can share like, what are called derivative works, where you can share like learned model parameters across customers, where you can get the similar effect. Yeah, so I definitely think that stuff is interesting. And you've still moved way up the stack to like a direct business problem, right? And the thing is that like the function of sales and marketing across different verticals is very, very similar. So you get a lot of reuse, whereas, something like working in a back office compliance problem in a bank might be very different from anything else outside of, banking or fintech. So you're not going to repurpose it across verticals. So, yeah. Where are we? Yeah.
As you know, technology investment in finance is probably one of the most active among all the sectors out there. Ever since the 70s, banks have been deploying, kind of like models that utilize some form of, like learning and now today they're doing machine learning. So when you look at finance as an overall industry in terms of how competitive it is, how do you assess kind of like competition from startups versus the incumbents like the banks and hedge funds that have created AI teams and things like that?
So I actually have a really lengthy post about this that is on my blog that talks about like quants versus machine learning and like the era of quants in finance versus the era of machine learning. So the way I think about it is actually pretty simple. It's like the quant era is like still very smart people, of course, but they're more trained in math, stats, physics, stuff like that. And they hack stuff together in like a systems building sense. And the machine learning era is like, these are people who are computer scientists that are also statisticians and can do all this other, fancy math and optimization stuff. And because they're computer scientists and engineers, foundationally, the stuff that they've been able to attack has just frankly been like larger scale, the results are superior, and they've just sort of like dramatically eclipsed what the quant world was able to do. And I think that those companies actually, frankly, like have struggled to adjust. When I left the hedge fund world, I was looking at, the top shops like D. Shaw and all these kinds of folks. And when I looked at what they were doing, it was honestly pretty crappy. When I looked at it, it was worse than some of the stuff I was already doing, and I didn't think I knew what I was doing. And when I looked at what my friends at places like Google were doing out in Silicon Valley, I was like, this is 15 years ahead. And this was around the 2005 to 2007 timeframe when I was seeing that. And I think the new approaches have eclipsed what was happening in banks and hedge funds for sure. They're really trying to struggle with how to figure out how to catch up right now. But fundamentally, they're just not like computing organizations that were built on like CS and engineering like in a deep way. like a company like Google or even Facebook now is. So they're trying to hire those people over there, like really desperately. You'll see this at the big banks, at the iBanks, at the hedge funds. They're trying to hire in the Google and Facebook people. They're paying huge amounts of money to try to bring them in and help them to like retool for this era. And some of them are more successful than others at doing that. But it's a big transformation in that I think the scale of these systems and the sophistication and just the results of them and the problems that you can attack are all like a level up from what was happening in the quant era.
Okay. Yeah. So we do quite a bit in compliance and fraud, and there's a lot of privacy implications and bureaucracy around that. So even just obtaining data can take 3 to 6 months. And so what have you seen in the startup space when you have to deal with those kinds of problems? Because I agree data is the most valuable thing out there, but when it's difficult to obtain, you spend a lot of time in this white space, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's an awesome question, and I deal with that a lot because a lot of these, I told you I'm interested in fintech stuff, and in particular like financial risk problems like this, because it's a little bit underserved, I think, in general. And there's a bunch of other reasons, but the point here is that's sensitive because you're dealing with risk and things that people don't just share easily. So you can have a big wait cycle for getting like the actual data that you need, and you have this sort of like catch-22 of why they would give you that data in the first place. So there's a number of approaches. The first one is definitely just as rigorously as you can search to see what papers people have done in academia and who might have some sort of anonymized data sets that you can get your hands on that are going around in academic circles. Oftentimes you can find stuff like that. Second one is simulations, right? I think that's one of the sort of like newer areas that you'll start to see is these sort of big data machine learning problems where you're just doing a vanilla classification or prediction problem with a massive amount of data. Like we know how to do that. There's tons of stuff you can do. It's really a solved problem. This issue where you're talking about where you're trying to tackle a problem and you have like either sparse data or no data and you have to bootstrap, there's a lot of problems like this and there's much less work. What I think you're going to start to see is more clever ways of simulating this stuff to generate a lot of data just in a fully bootstrapped fashion. Or other like these sort of like creative hacks like distance supervision or weak supervision in NLP where you start from something and bootstrap your way in with heuristics to a noisy data set, but it's like actually good enough to train with no human in the loop. So I think a lot of those types of techniques for like self-bootstrapping tricks with simulations and other things. And then I think the last one is like I was saying earlier, this sort of like these two tit-for-tat strategies where you have something that you have built that you can give them immediately, like you can tell them, we've identified these complicated new patterns based on things that are happening in the dark web, right? And we've got this dark web data, and we can run it against all your transactions, and anything that hits, we're going to tell you, and it's going to, this is an experiment, and we can like run it for free, and if we get a bunch of stuff and some of it turns out to be true, then you would want to work with us, right? So you can come up with some of these sorts of tricks where you basically do like they immediately want to opt into sharing the data with you. And then another one is more of a BD, customer development type of a hack, which is like, go around broadly, talk to people, find out if somebody already has like a little data, a quote unquote data lake or whatever set up with some data for doing this, because they have some strategic initiative where it's like, we need to kill like cross-channel fraud. It's like a really big issue for us this year. And so therefore we've set up this data set and we have some data scientist guy working on it. But if you guys are going to tackle this too, maybe we can get you in on a POC around this data set. So you can also, maybe 9 people tell you to bugger off, but 1 already has this set up, and sometimes you can find that. So it's a bit of a crapshoot, but if you can find it, that's awesome, because that's just real data.
That's actually the number one thing we found actually that worked for us.
Yeah, this last one? Yeah. Yeah, and more people are doing that, and they're really excited for startups to work on it. Oftentimes, if you play the social engineering part of it right, also the data science person on the inside will be excited to work with folks if you have good folks, because oftentimes they're like the lone wolf in there who are trying to learn how to do this stuff, and they only kind of know what they're doing, and it's exciting for them to work with like an awesome Silicon Valley team. So absolutely that can be a lure, right?
All right, we're going to have one last question back here.
Cool.
All right, here you go. Great. So going back to the hedge funds thing for a minute, there's been like a cottage industry of data startups around alternative data. So
Yeah.
aerial imagery, credit cards.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of these startups are basically, their premise is, well, we can sell to a new wave of hedge funds a data set that nobody else has. And
Right.
these hedge funds are in turn hiring like the types of folks at Netflix and Google. I'm just curious where you think that's going to go and what that's going to look like in 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it's probably not going to surprise you that I think it's a lousy model, right? It's just like, the idea is you're just selling these alphas, right? That you just like, basically you're doing feature extraction and flipping these alphas to hedge funds. It's exactly the naive approach that I'm trying to speak out against with this whole vertical AI thing, which is like, all you've done is a very, very simple machine learning problem. It's like a very low-level task-based thing. And now you're turning around and saying, I'm just going to sell the data from this, right? Well, what you've done will be commoditized very quickly, right? You know, a lot of people tell themselves, no, we're so smart, and other people aren't going to figure this out, or we've got the best team in the world for X or whatever, and that's just all not true, right? It's just like you've done a classifier, and you're trying to make a business out of it, and you don't really have anything. So you can, in the very beginning, you can make money off of these alphas, right? And there's people that are doing this, actually exploiting it and making a ton of cash. But it's sort of like this high-frequency trading type stuff, except a much smaller market, where you sort of like you can get some alpha on it for a while, and then the hedge funds will, if it's valuable enough and you're charging them a lot, they're just going to either do it themselves or whatever. They're just outsourcing to people, right, the process of generating these alphas. So if you want to know my thoughts about it, it's sort of like there's a company called WorldQuant, right, which is this crazy evil master plan that this brilliant Russian guy came up with to like farm out the generation of these alphas to a huge distributed network of people who have no idea how their alphas are being used in the overall trading system. That's basically what's happening here is the hedge fund industry is outsourcing to startups. Here, go and like dig around in the sand, and if you find any clams, like come back with them, right? And then gradually, once we know where the good spots are, then we just cut you out, right? So I don't think it's a good long-term model. Maybe you can make some money in the very short term, but I think the more interesting thing is if you can actually price something better based on this data, then why don't you go out and price it? Or even better, like what's sitting on top of pricing it? Is it like lending or underwriting or doing something in debt? Whatever it is, try to like move up the stack and don't like play in that space would be my advice.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
We